Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Red River Basin Cold Climate Agricultural Nutrient Reduction BMP Pre-Workshop webinar. We are happy to have you all here with us today, and the workshop, we're looking forward to seeing you in Crookston, Minnesota next week for the workshop. We've got a packed agenda, so we wanted to try to get a head start here with two pre-workshop webinars. The first one was covered basin geology with Scott Coram for Barra Engineering, and the second one covered basin soils and nutrient characteristics, and that was John Brecker from AgVice. My name is Rebecca Power. I will be moderating the session today. I am at the University of Wisconsin Division of Extension. And I just want to thank the many partners that have been involved in putting the workshop together and these pre-workshop webinars. Mike L. at the North Dakota Department of Health, Linda Kingery at the University of Minnesota Crookston, and many others, some of which are here on this call. So I would forget people if I tried to go through everyone. Okay, so before we get to our presenters, we're going to be talking about Red River Basin hydrology, runoff characteristics, and nutrient trends. We just want to give you a rundown of how this session will work. So you can see on that slide here to please submit your questions for presenters via the chat box, which is at the lower right-hand corner of your screen. There's a little purple tab there, and you should be able to find a little chat balloon there that you can click on to put questions in. We will wait till our presenters are finished at the end of the session to do the Q&A. So just put those questions in the chat box, and we will get through them one by one after the presenters are done. If you're having any issues with audio through your computer, you can use the phone-in option. That can be accessed by opening what's called the session menu at the upper left area of your screen. It's another little round tab, and there's an option for use your phone for audio. We will be recording the session, so it will be available, and the link available for you and for others that you think might find this information useful. That we'll get that up as soon as we can to have it available for other people to review. Okay, so on to the show. Our first speaker will be Henry Van Offelen, and he's a Red River Basin clean water specialist for the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources. Our next presenter will be Rochelle Nustad, who is a hydrologist with USGS, the Dakota Water Science Center. And then finally, Henry Wilson, who is a research scientist for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. So great panel today. And without further ado, we'll get on to Henry's presentation. And I won't read his bio there for you, but you can see who's talking to you and get a little bit more information about his many years of experience in working in water and soil resources, fisheries, and other water-related issues in the upper Midwest. So with that, go ahead, Henry.
Thank you. Good to be here today on a really snowy day here, or a snowy last day or so. Interesting that I'm the clean water person talking about hydrology, and the hydrologist titled person is talking about water quality. So I'm not sure how that happened, but here we are. I'm going to give you an overview of some of the work that we've been doing in Minnesota and looking at the Red River Basin related to hydrology. I do a lot of work with watersheds and watershed planning, and hydrology and changes in hydrology are part of the discussions and the goal setting process in those watershed plans. And my purposes today are to provide a general overview of the hydrologic conditions and trends in the Red Basin, and provide some hydrologic considerations for implementing best management practices. The overview of conditions and trends in the Red Basin, what you soon realize when you're charged with giving one of these talks is, wow, we have 2 states and a part of Canada here, and some of this is going to be Minnesota-centric. I tried to bring in as much as I could from both North Dakota and Canada, but a lot of the data here today will be sort of Minnesota-centric, but it does certainly apply elsewhere throughout the basin. So whenever I give talks on hydrology, it seems like we go to the hydrologic cycle. And you know, this is something we all learned in grade school, but it's very fundamental when you're thinking, discussing, and trying to plan for hydrologic conditions. In the hydrologic cycle, of course, we have precipitation as a primary factor, evapotranspiration, both from plants and from surface waters. We have shallow water infiltration. We have groundwater infiltration to deep groundwater, and then we have runoff. So with that understanding, you can look at a water balance, and for the purposes, you know, it's quite straightforward. We have precip. You subtract off evapotranspiration throughout the year or on a longer time scale. You have groundwater recharge, and in this case, I'm talking about recharge to groundwater that's deep, not shallow interflow that is ending up as part of your runoff at a gauge. And then you have runoff. And, you know, we can't make water disappear, but so we end up, whatever doesn't end up as runoff is either evapotranspirated or a small portion goes deep groundwater discharge. And for most practical purposes, we don't really factor this in much, the groundwater recharge, into these water balances, because in most cases, particularly at the watershed scale over the long term, it is a single-digit fraction of the water budget. So, and thanks to Dave Mulla for a couple of these slides he sent out to a bunch of us. This is our average annual precip in the Red Basin, going from less in the north and the west to more on the Minnesota side. And that range is from 19.5 inches to about 30 inches of precip.
Mine is working, but I can't hear it through here, so I just
called it. And I wasn't able to find an ET slide, an evapotranspiration, but Dave also provided this mean annual temp, which is probably a reasonable surrogate to some extent for evapotranspiration, but similar pattern, colder to the north, likely to be less ET, more to the south, and then centered highest in the valley floor. And if we look at runoff that happens, this is Minnesota runoff, but in the basin here, about only 10 to 15, maybe a little bit more of precip ends up as runoff. And on the North Dakota side, this is going to be less than 10%, and these extend into Canada. So 90% of our precip is essentially going to ET, roughly, which is different than other parts of at least the state of Minnesota, where substantially more runoff occurs per unit precip. And this amounts to about 2 to 3 inches of runoff for the Red Basin each year annually. In really high years, we might have 5 or 6 inches of runoff from a high precip year. So with that background, there's been one study that I like to point to, which is more about changes in precip and runoff patterns, but they did an analysis of the Red River Basin and provide a lot of good hydrology information that's pretty quantitative. And so this is trends in 7 different stream flow metrics in the Red River Basin at Grand Forks, and they looked at 22 different gauges. In mean annual stream flow, which is this black line, peak daily flow in the spring, summer, fall, high flows, low flows. 7 different metrics, and how that's changed over time. And up until the early 90s, things were in quite a bit of variability, but something during the early 90s time period has changed the hydrologic conditions generally in the Red Basin. And another way to look at this is a double mass curve, which plots cumulative precip versus cumulative runoff. You expect generally a straight linear relationship. Somewhere starting, back in the 80s or late 70s, it started to deviate from the line, and then runoff per unit precip increased somewhere around 1990. Then they also looked at monthly changes in stream flow and precip. So this is the precipitation, looking at monthly precip, and every place that there is a color-coded slice of the pie, there is either a change in a statistically significant change in precipitation, or the distribution of precipitation, or the percentage of precipitation that occurred in that month. So in the Red Basin, comparing between a 35 to 74 time period and a 75 to 2013 time period, we've got significantly more runoff, and the percentage of runoff is higher in September and October than it used to be. And then there's more runoff in March than there has been. This is precip. This is all precip on this side. And in stream flow, we've seen increases in stream flow in almost every month except April. So over time, both precip has changed, particularly in the fall, and stream flow is higher throughout the year comparing these two time periods. They also looked at storage as part of a water balance, and the Red Basin line here is this purple one. Storage throughout the year, and the change in storage in a water balance by month. And basically what this graph is showing us is that they have negative storage in the spring, suggesting there's not enough precipitation in ET to produce the observed flows. So the flows are higher in these parts of the month than they would expect using the water balance. And the flows are lower in this part of the year, which suggests that there's been an increase in storage within soil, groundwater, and reservoirs. And then that water balance also, they've got a couple different scenarios for 2 different time periods. Here's a one that ends at 74. Here's one that goes to the early 2000s, and then the rest of the 2000s. And our mean annual precip has been increasing in any of these scenarios. Our mean flow has been increasing, ET has increased, and storage on an annual basis has decreased. And some of the items they point to as a driver of this is cropping patterns in the basin. The blue line here is corn and soybeans. The brown line is hay and small grains. And that's probably, that is the biggest change, where we've seen a switch in cropping patterns. This black line is total acres in crop. That hasn't changed, and actually it's gone down a little bit. I'm not sure if that's ticked up since the 2015 period. And then they also looked at a drainage over time, and that really hasn't changed all that much in the basin using the approach that they did to quantify it. So that's some background from that study. I'm going to now point to some gauge data sort of showing the picture of hydrology throughout the year from a couple gauges, mostly in this part of the basin, which that study was doing the rest of the basin. This is precip throughout the watersheds we look at. The precip is increasing. In general, there's a trend of increased precipitation. And in the Minnesota side of the basin, we've seen on average about 1 inch to almost 3 inch increases if we compare the 50s to the mid 80s to the mid 80s to the mid 2000 teens. And just, you know, sometimes folks don't quite appreciate an inch of runoff, say in the Red Lake River, that's 80,000 acre feet of water on average coming down onto the landscape more than it did in the past. So a large volume of water in an inch of precip. Storm intensity is another issue on the precip side of things, and particularly when talking about BMPs, I think. Mostly what these are showing you at different weather stations is we've seen an uptick over time periods in this blue bar, which is the 2 to 3 inch runoffs or rainfall events in a 24-hour to 48-hour period. So the really big rain events, we haven't really seen an increase in those, but the 2 to 3 inch rainfall, we are seeing an increase. And this is annual runoff trends at some different gauges throughout that northwestern Minnesota. Generally over the period of record, they show a similar pattern of more runoff, particularly in the last 20 to 30 years compared to the previous time periods. And this is the seasonal runoff at some gauges. Low flows throughout the early part of the year. In the winter, peaking in April generally, or May, and then declining throughout the rest of the year with a slight uptick in or leveling off in late summer. The thing to notice on these graphs is that the black dashed line is the long-term average, and the higher line, the green line, or the highest line in the graphs are all the most recent time period. So we are generally seeing, particularly in the fall, higher flows compared to historic conditions. And then this is a graph from another study done in Minnesota, but it's the runoff coefficients for different time periods in our river basins. This is the red basin here, the lower graph, the lower line. We have seen a steady increase in runoff coefficients. The runoff per unit precip has steadily increased in the red basin, which is consistent with the study I presented earlier. It's you can't give one of these talks without talking a little bit about flooding. We, of course, are prone to major flooding, and I think the geology talked about that a little bit. We've had a history of major spring floods dating back to 1826. And we had a pretty large flood event this spring, which now it appears will have a double peak, at least in some areas. And I must also mention that, you know, droughts are part of this. I don't have a picture of that, but the Palmer Drought Severity Index for the region, you know, shows a pattern of periods of drought for a number of years, and then wet periods. And we clearly are in a wet period since the early 90s, according to the Palmer Drought Severity Index throughout the basin. And, you know, longer term trends, and maybe Rochelle will talk to this a little bit, have, you know, shown that the basin has gone through major cycles of wet periods and dry periods throughout its history. Okay, and here's, I don't know if anybody else has seen it, but there's a climate hydrology assessment tool that the Corps has. This is an annual peak flow at Drayton. We've seen peak flows increase, again, consistent with that last slide showing major floods. The major floods have become more frequent, especially since the 1990s. And the Corps' this climate hydrology tool lets you do a prediction of what they run 93 different climate change models and look at what precip is going to, how precip is going to change over time. The models show a lot of variability, but the trend line is increasing precip throughout, as we move ahead in time. And there's other models on climate change. This is one just pulled out that's just projected change in winter precip, potentially substantially more winter precip in this region. So with that, that's kind of an overview of the hydrology and the conditions throughout the basin. And now I'm going to switch over and gear this towards some considerations as we think about best management practices today and then at the conference next week. We seem to be in a trend, at least for now, to having increasing precipitation and runoff. And those are disjointed a little bit with increasing runoff per unit precipitation. Storm intensity, at least of those 2 to 3 inch storms, has changed, and that's, I would say, is expected to continue. We've had changes to cropping and cropping practices. We've had changes to drainage, changes to storage, changes to non-contributing area, and then I also want to just touch on there's a lot of data and tools for citing best management practices when you're thinking about hydrology and hydrology goals. A framework that I've been using to talk about these issues is we've got these historic drivers of hydrology, climate, and humans. We've been making changes to pathways on the landscape. Those are our water flow paths. We treat in this model evapotranspiration as a pathway. That's part of the water cycle. And then channel shapes. We also have changes to storage, both surface and soil storage. These result in a hydrologic response. That's some of what I've shown you today. Differences in magnitude, timing, seasonal patterns of flow. And then a separate talk, not for today, but is what are those effects of these hydrologic alterations, these changes in hydrologic response? So as you think about BMPs, think about how they change pathways to water flow and how they change the storage capacity of the landscape. You're familiar with the water balance. Again, that's the long-term water balance we covered. Also think about the event-based water balance, which is more dependent on precipitation, short-term detention storage, to a much smaller extent evapotranspiration. If you're talking about an event, one single rainfall event, the ET is not as big a factor as it would be in an annual time scale, and then runoff. And another way to picture these is we can do practices on the landscape that reduce runoff volume, which is basically by increasing ET, or we can do things that store water, detain water temporarily, say here on the early part of a hydrograph, and move the water later on into the hydrograph. So there's two sort of combination effects, timing and volume, that best management practices can have in hydrology. And these are the actions, sort of the mode of action that we can take to achieve, at least from my perspective as a watershed planner, hydrology goals, which would be no increase in runoff, runoff reduction, or peak flow reduction. We can increase storage on the landscape. That would be temporary or permanent, surface and subsurface. We can improve the management of existing storage, or we can increase evapotranspiration. And think about how all the best management practices can fit into these three categories. And long-term storage does increase evapotranspiration, so I threw it in there. And I would say that these are the only options to improve hydrologic conditions, affect water balance, regardless of whether you're more inclined to think that hydrologic alteration is due to climate or to humans. And there's an ongoing debate about, is it mostly climate, is it mostly humans? as a watershed planner, I'm more interested in what are the solutions and how do we make the landscape more resilient. And I think in the frame of it really doesn't matter what the cause is. These are the only things we can affect on the landscape to help improve things. And we've developed a list of best management, taken a list of best management practices, grouped them, and then given a reference on whether they increase evapotranspiration, increase soil water holding capacity, increase short-term surface storage, detention, or increase long-term storage. So, you know, this list might be useful to some. Most of this crop and soil management are increasing ET or soil water holding capacity. Infield drainage water management typically are increasing short-term surface storage. Things like surface flow management are increasing ET generally. Water storage BMPs, saturated buffers, impoundments, constructed wetlands, those are hitting mostly on that increasing short-term surface storage, as are in-channel water retention activities such as two-stage ditches with restrictive size culverts, existing, you know, protecting that floodplain storage that exists on the landscape, and then things like the Red River Basin, at least the Red River Watershed Management Board is trying to implement some design standards for surface drainage. Oh, that's my timer. Okay, and I'm wrapping up here. Just for those that aren't familiar, there are a whole lot of models, hydrologic models and hydraulic models available in the Red Basin that I'm just going to touch on a couple of the big ones quick. The Red Board and the Red River Basin Commission have done a HMS modeling of the entire basin and model all the tributaries and have a 20% flow reduction goal. We have this HMS results in all the watersheds that can be used. In this case, this is at Crookston, which catchments will give us the most benefit for 1 acre-foot of storage to reduce the flood peak. Those are the areas in blue. The areas in red have the least effect on the flood peak at Crookston. And then we also have HSPF models that have been done, at least, and those can be used to do the same thing. These green areas are contributing the most to peak flow events. I think I missed. And then we also have that HSPF model, which can be used to look at runoff coefficients. Where is the most water per unit precip coming from within a watershed? Those might be the areas that we target certain types of best management practices. And then lastly, this is a map of the status of digital elevation model conditioning. Pay attention to the colors. Basically, we have the lowest level of conditioning in this area. It's called a level 2. The rest of the basin, we have level 3 or better than level 3. Very good, highly refined digital elevation models to build hydrologic models on. PTM app is another tool that's in development that's trying to look for places on the landscape, site-specific places for putting BMPs on the ground. And I'll just mention non-contributing areas because I'm out of time, but we do have mapped non-contributing areas throughout the basin for a 10-year summer storm event. This is the Boy to Sioux watershed, North Minnesota, North Dakota. Here's an example of those non-contributing areas. These are areas that do not contribute in a 10-year storm event or are estimated not to contribute runoff. And this is the Maple River in North Dakota. Again, there are areas still left that are non-contributing that should be part of the discussion of our best management practices and where to do them depending on our goals. So with that, I am done.
Great, thank you, Henry, so much. And I have to say, I had a couple of questions going through, and you answered them as you continued with your slides. So thanks so much for your presentation. And for others that may not have gotten their questions answered, please go ahead and put those questions in the chat box for Henry, and we will get to them after our next, oops. we've got multiple controllers here. Okay, so Rochelle Nustad from USGS, Dakota Water Science Center. And Rochelle is going to be covering nutrient characterization and trends in surface waters in the Red River Basin. So welcome, Rochelle, and thanks so much.
Thank you. I guess I'm a Henry sandwich. I'm the filling in the Henry sandwich. I have Henry, then me, then Henry. So thank you. I am going to do an overview, basically, of the nutrient trends and loads that we're seeing in the Red River Basin. And this is kind of a larger scale view and focused on the surface water. So just to touch on where this information is coming from, primarily it is coming from a trend analysis effort that the USGS has been doing using PW trend modeling software. And that effort has been a collaborative effort with different agencies across the basin. We have the Canadians involved and the US side involved as well. So it's great that we have that collaborative effort going to do this work. The other source of my information is a few slides that Mike L had provided to me, and then the Sparrow Model information that Dr. Mula had prepared. So the problem, as most of you are aware of, is that there is nutrient enrichment occurring in Lake Winnipeg, and Lake Winnipeg is the 10th largest freshwater lake in the world. It's an important fishery for Canada, as well as a recreational lake for those folks there as well. And the interesting thing is that only 16% of the annual inflow to the lake is coming from the Red River, but nearly 70% of the annual phosphorus load to the lake is from the Red River. And then 34% of the nitrogen load is coming from the Red River. So as a result of the issue with the nutrient enrichment, the Water Quality Committee of the International Red River Board has been working on nutrient objectives for the border station, the Red River at Emerson, which I have highlighted there with the red arrow. And I will be talking a little bit about what those draft targets are a bit later. So most of you are familiar with this, but I just wanted to point out that the basin does have those nutrient-rich soils that are draining that ancient glacial Lake Agassiz. I think Scott mentioned a little bit about this in his talk, and that does play a role in some of the nutrient availability. We do have major urban centers along the Red River, which also have some influence on nutrients in the river, and with the biggest one being Lake Winnipeg. The city of Winnipeg. So the nutrient questions that I will try to look at in this presentation, I do not have all the answers, but I hope to be able to provide some information on some of these. So what do the trends look like for the basin as a whole? And I'm going to focus on primarily total phosphorus. I will kind of go back and forth a little bit between total nitrogen and nitrate plus nitrite. How have those concentrations and loads changed through time? And these are using that PW trend I mentioned earlier. How do the nutrient loads differ seasonally? And how are the nutrient loads distributed across the basin? And important, and Henry set me up for this, is how to take into account those trends when we know that we have natural stream flow variability. So given the Red River Basin, we know that the only thing that's really constant about our climate is variability. I think today is a good example of that. We woke up to lots of snow. Yesterday there wasn't snow on the ground. And we do have those multi-decadal periods of wet and dry climatic conditions that happen. I'm just going to give you a quick, show you just a little bit with Devil's Lake, an example of how that hydroclimatic variability does exhibit itself in a naturally closed lake basin. So this is Devil's Lake, the lake levels over the last 4,000 years, and it was lake levels that have been recreated from the North Dakota Geological Survey through radiocarbon dating of sediment. The multi-decadal periods of wet and dry climates you can see have happened over the last 4,000 years, and just want to point out that there are periods of time where it's very high, it's overflowing to the Cheyenne River, and then it's very dry. And this blue area is the recent time frame. And if you look at this plot, you can see in 1940, after the Dust Bowl, the lake level is right around 1,400 feet. And as Henry had mentioned, around 1993, we get this abrupt increase in inflow, and our elevation in that Crow's Lake Basin goes up about 25 feet. So it's very responsive, Devil's Lake is, to those hydroclimatic changes. And as a result, we see those changes in our stream flow. So this is the Red River at Emerson, that border station. And this is just demonstrating that the mean stream flow has basically doubled from that dry climate state to the wet climate state. So what we've been using is QW trend, and that is a tool that we can, a statistical time series model that we can use to analyze trends. And the important piece that I want you to take away from this, not that I'm going to go into great detail here, is this, that the flow-related variability is addressed with the QW trend model. And given what Henry talked about and what I've shown you, it's important to address that when you're taking into account trends. And the QW trend package will be available in summer of 2019 in an R form. So our QW trend software package will be available. So this is the data that we had to work with. As I mentioned, we have a collaborative effort, and so we got information from Environment Climate Change Canada, Manitoba Sustainable Development, the Minnesota, North Dakota, and the USGS folks. So we have US and Canadian data available. For this purpose, this presentation, I'm just going to be presenting results for most of the sites for trend analysis that we did from 2000 to 2015 for total phosphorus and nitrate plus nitrite. And then for Red River at Emerson and the Red River at Selkirk, I will be showing you the trends from 1970 to 2015. We do have more long-term sites, we do have more parameters we're analyzing, but for this purpose, I will be just focusing on those. So this is looking at the whole basin and what do the trends look like for the whole basin for total phosphorus from 2000 to 2015. I just want to point out that we have some upward triangles that indicate upward trends, some downward triangles that are indicating downward trends, and we defined how significant those trends are by putting a value with those key values. So just wanted to point out that in the lower part of the basin, we mainly have those downward triangles indicating that the southern basin generally has decreasing concentrations. Something happens between Fargo and Grand Forks, and I'm not sure that I know the answer to that exactly, but there's something that's going on that causes that trend to increase in Grand Forks, and then once we go downstream on the Red River, there tends to be those increasing total phosphorus trends. One thing I want to point out is here in the Minnesota upper, our northern part of the basin, we are missing a few. We don't have as many tributaries because we didn't have data for that. And then Manitoba, those tributaries I don't have analyzed yet, so that's why those are missing. So that is just a snapshot of the basin as a whole and what those trends look like over the past, well, 2000 to 2015, 15-year period. So this is looking at a longitudinal snapshot of total phosphorus, and this was provided by Mike L. It's a synoptic survey that was done in August of 2010. So it's kind of showing just a point in time, what's happening from upstream to downstream. This is from Wahpeton, where the Red River starts, to Pembina, the Canadian border. And generally, we're seeing that the concentrations are increasing from Wahpeton to Fargo, and then there's this pretty abrupt increase. Concentrations kind of are the same, and then they decrease at Grand Forks and then stay around the same up to the border. I think that this is the Red Lake River that's causing that influence of the decreasing concentrations there. So this is looking at the trend analysis of the total phosphorus concentrations and how have they changed over time for that 1970 to 2015 period. And here we have identified 3 trend periods I will call them early, middle, and late. And on the y-axis, you have the total phosphorus concentration. On the x-axis, we have the years. And the green points are those model concentrations, and the black line is the fitted trend. The red line I have on this, I haven't plotted on both. It's the concentration target that I mentioned that the Red River Board is working on for the Emerson site, and that is set at or being proposed at 0.15 milligrams per liter. I have it on both plots just for reference, but it's really only going to be applicable to the Emerson site. So the thing I wanted to point out here is that generally we see an overall uptrend for both sites, but notice that the pattern of getting from point A to point B is not the same. So during the early period, we see that concentrations are rapidly increasing at Emerson, but they tend to be stable at Selkirk. And then in the middle period, the concentrations stabilize at Emerson, but are increasing significantly at Selkirk. Or, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. So the Emerson is increasing significantly in the late period and then more stable in Selkirk. So it's important to not only know where the trends are occurring, it's important to look at when the trends are occurring. So seeing when the trends are occurring can help you start to understand and have some, maybe identify some potential causes of what's causing those trends to happen. I don't necessarily have those answers right now, but some things that might be affecting that are the changes in crops, taking land out of CRP. One thing to note about Selkirk is that it is influenced by the Assiniboine River comes in upstream of Selkirk, and then the city of Winnipeg is just upstream of Selkirk. So this is looking at the total phosphorus load. So the previous slide was those concentrations, and now this is looking at the loads, and same two sites, but we are taking into account that stream flow with the concentration to compute the load. And I am using flux and load interchangeably. So the things to notice on the graph are that the points are the unbiased estimates of the actual annual load. So you're going to see that those vary a lot from year to year because that's representing those wet, dry years, determining how much that load is. The black line is the flow normalized annual load. So that flow normalized line represents basically what would have happened in the loads if stream flow conditions were the same year after year. The red lines that I had on the previous one are it's kind of a similar idea. It's just that these are set for loads. For Emerson, there is a draft target load of 1,400 metric tons per year. I've converted that to metric tons per day to fit the output that I'm presenting. And then Manitoba has a load target for Red River at Selkirk of 2,800 metric tons per year, or 7.67 metric tons per day. So just to think about this, the points are really variable because they do reflect that stream flow variability from year to year. But that black trend line does show that despite the increasing stream flow, we are still seeing that total phosphorus has increased. And looking at that trend line, Selkirk doesn't have that huge increase that Emerson has. And if you look at the table up here, you can see that from the 1970 timeframe, less than 50% of the load at Selkirk was coming from the watershed upstream or downstream, upstream of Emerson. And then when we got to 2015, the load portion at Selkirk is more than 50% of it is coming from Emerson. So that has changed through time. So then also still looking at loads, but we're presenting them a little bit differently here. How are they changing throughout the year? And we're presenting that as a percentage. So this is showing the percentage of that load is coming, for the annual load that is coming per season. So if you look at the high flow years, so I selected 4 high flow years, and it looks 75% is basically what is being contributed during the spring, what I called spring, so March through May, is being contributed. That percentage of the annual load is being contributed during that season. And then moving over to the low flow years, I use 2003, 2008, and 2012. You can see that the distribution of that load comes between basically spring and summer, and it comes to about 80% roughly of the load is happening between those two seasons. So then there's also some discussion about phosphorus and what is, we're using total phosphorus, but total phosphorus is capturing the dissolved portion as well as the particulate form. And this is looking at what percentage of the total phosphorus is in the dissolved form. So percentage of dissolved phosphorus by month for three stations, the Red River at Fargo, the Red River at Grand Forks, and the Red River at Pembina. And this is USGS data that Mike L. prepared. And generally, we're just seeing that the percentage of dissolved phosphorus tends to be the highest during the winter months and lowest in those spring months. For the Pembina, I just wanted to point out that the reason that this one looks odd is because there were only 4 samples collected in the month of November. So kind of a strange plot there. But the point, I guess, is just that it does generally tend to be the dissolved form in the winter months and the particulate form in those spring months when we have the highest loading. So then changing to the Sparrow Model results, and just to point out that we've been looking more at trends, so how is the concentration or the load changing over time. This is a snapshot of what the loads look like by watershed for kind of a long-term average. They call it the 2002 Sparrow Model, and that's because that's what they call their base year. So basically the annual loads have been standardized to that year 2002. So it's a way to look at how the loads are distributed across the basin and different from looking at how have they changed over time. And the red watersheds are the ones that have the largest loads, the green are the smallest loads. And from the plot, you can start to be identifying watersheds that you might want to prioritize because they might have the higher phosphorus load contribution, as opposed to the darkest green is the lowest phosphorus load contribution. And it's my understanding these slides are going to be provided at the workshop as well. So then moving on to the nitrate plus nitrate, the whole basin picture, it does look a little different from phosphorus. Again, this is from the 2000 to 2015 time frame. And looking at the southern basin or the upper watershed, we have the trends tending to be upward and significantly upward down here. It's my understanding that the Sioux watershed does have, I think it has more drain tile. At least they started implementing drain tile in that watershed earlier than the other watersheds in the basin. So the upward trend that might be related to drainage tile, I don't know that for sure. But the concentrations tend to be increasing in the southern basin. And then as you get further downstream towards Grand Forks, and as you go down to Lake Winnipeg, we have those increasing upward trends. There could be different things that are happening in there, but this is the picture kind of as a whole in the basin of what those trends look like for nitrate plus nitrate. This is going back to total nitrogen for that longitudinal snapshot, and for this, it looks a little different than the phosphorus does in the sense that it's pretty stable, constant concentration from Wahpeton to Fargo, increases downstream of Fargo, which is what phosphorus did as well. But then there is just a constant, more or less not unchanging concentration of total nitrogen as we go from Fargo Moorhead to the border. So this is looking at, similar to phosphorus, that change over season for the nitrate plus nitrite. And a similar pattern is observed. About 80% of the load is happening in spring during those high flow years, which is similar to the total phosphorus, which I had said was about 75%. And then if you look at those low flow years, again, that spring and summer season tends to be when those loads are distributed um, pretty similarly. But most of the load, again, about 80% is being contributed during those two seasons, which makes sense. I mean, that's the time frame of when we have the most precipitation and we have crops and things going on in the landscape. And total nitrogen, similar picture. So it's consistent with the nitrate plus nitrite. The numbers might be a little bit lower. The other one we saw 80% during the spring. This is around 75. But again, being fairly evenly distributed between the two seasons of spring and summer. So this is looking at that similar to the total phosphorus, the total nitrogen trends for the Emerson and Selkirk site. So the pattern is a little different than what we saw for total phosphorus. I want to point out that for Emerson, I didn't have data from starting in 1970, so I'm going to not have a lot of confidence in the 70 to 85 time frame. So we'll look more at the 1985 to 2015 time frames. So looking at those middle and late period. And so different from total phosphorus, the pattern and trends over time is similar between the sites, whereas the pattern was slightly different between the two sites. For the total phosphorus, these are similar. The middle period showing significant increasing trend at both sites. And for the late period, the concentrations are basically stable. So even though they've increased from 1970 to 2000, well, 78 to 2015, it was more increased early period, and now they have kind of stabilized. So looking at the same two sites, the same time frame, but looking at the loads, again, remembering that the trend line is the estimated flux that would have occurred if stream flow conditions were the same year after year. This pattern is different from the total phosphorus picture. The load at Selkirk has increased, but it isn't necessarily due, if you look at Emerson, 36 metric tons per day in 78 to 37 metric tons per day in 2015. But the increase at Selkirk is much percentage-wise greater than what's happening at Emerson. So for total nitrogen, something different is happening. And again, looking at Sparrow and looking at the watersheds the sub-watersheds that tend to have that red color to them. I don't have the total phosphorus picture here, but it does look similar to what we saw for the total phosphorus picture. And generally those same sub-watersheds have the larger total nitrogen loads. So I don't have all the answers to the questions, but I have a lot of information that we can start thinking about some of the things that are going on. The trends, are telling us how those concentrations are changing over time. From 2000 to 2015, those total phosphorus concentrations generally are decreasing in the southern basin, but the nitrate plus nitrite concentrations tended to be increasing in the southern basin. And then as we went downstream towards Lake Winnipeg, both total phosphorus and total nitrogen generally had increasing trends. From 70 to 75, we are seeing those total phosphorus and total nitrogen concentrations increasing for Emerson and Selkirk, but the timing and magnitude of the trends are different. And so you can't just say that from 1970 to 1975, I mean, you can say that it's increased, but understanding where those increases have happened in time can help you to start understanding what has influenced those changes in the agriculture and the urban influences that might be happening. And the loads for total phosphorus from what we see between Emerson and Selkirk, the loads for total phosphorus have increased substantially for Emerson from 1970 to 2015. The seasonal pattern that we saw was consistent among each of the constituents, as well as the pattern that we saw between the high flow and the low flow years. The majority of the phosphorus and nitrogen load are occurring in the spring in those high flow years. The low flow years, the load tends to be distributed pretty evenly between spring and summer. And then that distribution of the loads across the basin from the Sparrow Model, they tend to be, I say differentially distributed, but the loads tend to be similar in similar sub-basins, having those same sub-watersheds tend to have high loads for total nitrogen and total phosphorus. So the next step would be, in understanding what's going on, would be to use some trend attribution. We hope to be able to do that with PW trend to be able to identify why some of those trends have happened, or why some of those trends are happening. And that's it. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Rochelle. Okay, we're gonna keep moving here and make sure we have some time at the end for questions if we can. So thanks, Rochelle, and on to Henry. Henry Wilson is going to be talking to us about seasonal nutrient trends in edge of field runoff. And you can see a little bit more about Dr. Wilson there. And we're going to get right to his content. So thanks so much and welcome.
Okay, thanks. Before I start into a long monologue here, I'm just going to start by checking to make sure that I'm still being heard clearly through my headset.
You sound great.
Okay, good. So I'm going to focus this introductory talk primarily on describing some of the seasonal patterns of nutrient runoff that I've observed by myself and others in the region at the single field and the small agricultural watershed scale. So I hope this is fairly complementary to the talk that we just had from Rachelle. I'll delve briefly into why we see differences between seasons and watersheds, but I'll leave more in-depth discussion of connections with land management for the main workshop. So to do this, I've structured this talk around topics that are noted here in the outline. The general question of when nitrogen and phosphorus transport are occurring in the region, in what form nitrogen and phosphorus transport are occurring, at least at this scale, and when is that, or when are those concentrations highest, and thinking about differences between rain and snowmelt events, and coming back to the soil phosphorus, runoff phosphorus relationships that we saw introduced in the first webinar, and thinking about whether there's some seasonality there. And then from this, thinking about maybe what some of the implications of a changing climate might be. So if I pose the question of when nitrogen and phosphorus transport are occurring in the region, the short answer is when water moves, or when water is moving. And most studies, at least at the finer scale regionally, have observed that 75% or more of the annual nitrogen and phosphorus export occurs with snowmelt runoff. So in areas where a larger portion of precipitation occurs as snowmelt, then as opposed to rainfall runoff, then that proportion tends to be higher. But the dominance of snowmelt toward nutrient export has been pretty commonly observed. But if we consider that north-south gradient in terms of the climate conditions in the slide that was shared by Dr. Moa, there may be some increasing importance of rainfall runoff transport as we move north and south and through those areas. But keeping in mind the high amount of evapotranspiration in summer that Henry mentioned in his talk, snowmelt tends to be pretty important at the finer scale. But I'll bring in some data that we have from small watersheds here in Manitoba just to illustrate that large rainfall events can still be pretty important when we're thinking about movement at the field scale. And so what's shown in this figure is a frequency distribution of what proportion of see if I get my pointer here on this site here. What proportion of annual runoff nutrient loads and volume of runoff occurred over multiple years of measurement of runoff from 10 fields in Manitoba? So there's multiple site years for those fields here. And then on the other axis, that's just proportional to the number of events. So those bars, so the highest one here would be 17 of the site years. But we can see that in all cases, there's a fairly long tail. Certainly there's a tendency towards most or all of the load for these nutrients and of water yield to happen during snowmelt. And this is towards the northern end of the region. So that's something else to keep in mind. But this long tail does indicate that there's a number of important rainfall runoff events that occurred and contributed to load. In some cases, it might be a low snowfall year, but in most cases, this is when we had large rainfall runoff events. And so those large events can result in significant runoff, but they tend to occur more rarely than annual snowmelt event. So it's not something that we have captured as well. So coming back to or thinking about the same data set or working with the same data set, we're still completing some of our analysis for the different nitrogen species and the particulate forms. But with the subset of the data we have so far, I'll use that to illustrate typically most of the nitrogen we see leaving with surface runoff from cropland is in the form of nitrate. So what's shown in this figure are the flow weighted mean concentrations for the entire snowmelt period of nitrate and of total nitrogen. So this includes particulate and dissolved forms. And in most cases, there's clustering pretty close to this 1-to-1 line, which indicates that 100 would indicate 100% of the nitrogen moving as nitrate. And this is fairly typical of what we've seen in some of the other paired watershed studies. But ammonium is something that is another species that does become increasingly important when we start to think about manure and plant sources, and I expect that's something that will come up during presentations next week. But something to note here is that there were some significant erosion events, and although those are rare, they can move large amounts of nitrogen in a particulate form. For phosphorus, we're a little bit more caught up with our analysis, and so the dissolved fraction and the particulate fraction, again, are highly correlated. Turn off my pointer. And although those rare erosion events do occur and can result in a fairly large amount of particulate phosphorus moving from fields, even with snowmelt runoff in this case, there's a tendency towards most movement happening in a dissolved form, and those cases where there are erosion events tend to be rare, and I've also found them a little bit harder to predict. So reading through the literature and talking to some of my colleagues with more experience on the topic of tile drainage, it seems that the regional data to evaluate, at least particularly as we move north and are talking about clay soils and moving north, that regional data is just sort of starting to come together to think about this question of what the impact on timing and form of nitrogen and phosphorus movement might be. But some of the results that have been published so far from Coquelin and others in Manitoba suggest that surface flow still dominates the water balance during snowmelt because there are frozen soils, and the frequency of overland flow actually remains fairly similar as well, just because of infiltration rates and the intensity of events that actually result in runoff. And so I'm going to leave my discussion of tile here and suggest we're going to receive quite a bit more on that during the structural BMP section when we're talking next week. And I've noted the talk that I know of that will focus on partitioning, but there's also a couple others that are planned, so I should have probably noted those as well. So what's shown on this slide, coming back to thinking about when nitrogen and phosphorus concentrations are highest when we're talking about edge of field runoff. What's shown here are concentrations of dissolved phosphorus and nitrate measured in samples collected over 5 years at one of our more intensively sampled sites. And the scales on each axis are logarithmic, with concentration on the y-axis, or on the y-axis, and flow on the rate on the x-axis. And so the red points are samples that were collected during snowmelt, and the blue crosses are samples collected during rainfall runoff events. I'm not going to go into too much discussion about hysteresis, but what I want to note in showing these plots is that the concentrations for both snowmelt and rainfall runoff events cover similar ranges, with maybe a little bit wider range of variation for nitrate from rainfall runoff. This is surface runoff that we're looking at again. And low phosphorus concentrations, there are a few points here. Those are early spring events that occurred just after snowmelt, which is a little bit rare, we found. But for typical events, or for the larger events, the ranges between seasons, between snowmelt and between rainfall runoff events of concentration are actually fairly similar. And we've seen this as a typical pattern at all the sites that we've been working at. So this is for phosphorus. This is a topic that we've been exploring in smaller agricultural watersheds of the Assiniboine River, which up here is more of the prairie pothole kind of topography, and of the Red River, including some in the valley with clay soils and low topography, and a couple others with more of a groundwater influence, one which is more on the escarpment. And although some of these watersheds do exhibit a significant relationship between phosphorus concentration and rate of flow, concentration discharge relationship, most also show a consistent and even stronger temporal trend within season when it comes to phosphorus concentration. And so there's a peak at the beginning of snowmelt, and again as stream temperature nears its peak in early summer. So what's shown in this figure are the residuals from concentration discharge relationships, or just deviation from the mean concentration if there is no significant concentration discharge pattern. And these residuals or deviations from the mean are plotted versus days since melt. And so although the timing of this second peak concentration in summer differs somewhat between sites, it generally at all these sites correspond to the timing of temperature changes. And so there's seasonal changes in flow path that happen with increasing, and then there's probably some increasing importance of in-stream processes later in the season that can partially explain this pattern. But these sites near the top are sites flowing from the Manitoba or Pembina escarpment with greater groundwater influence, or just that have greater groundwater influence in general. And this is maybe partly why they don't follow quite the same trend as these other streams, which are maybe what we would think of as more typical prairie streams with more wetland-like characteristics. I think it's fair to say that phosphorus concentration dynamics, at least at this scale in streams, have received more research attention regionally. But that said, nitrogen concentrations have been observed in agricultural streams during rainfall runoff events. And often these are lower during those rainfall events than for snowmelt events in these primarily surface drained watersheds. And this makes some sense if we think about reductions being more likely in the summer with denitrification and assimilation under warmer, wetter conditions, both sort of en route to stream and in the field. So I'm going to wrap up my introduction of some of the temporal patterns that we're observing in small agricultural watersheds in Manitoba by making the point that although there are strong seasonal trends that are seemingly independent of flow, at least for phosphorus, when we kind of control for those seasonal trends, the importance of high flow event timing and interaction with availability of a nutrient source is something that we should keep in mind. So what's shown on this slide are results from a general additive model that was developed with multiple years of data from 21 of these small watersheds that we're working with in Manitoba. And there is a seasonal or temporal function that's part of that model, but we can only show so many variables at once in a figure. So what's shown here are the land use and flow rate effects, both of which are important and significant in these models. And so the contours on each plot indicate concentrations predicted by the models, and the x-axis indicates flow rate, the y-axis the percent of the watershed area as cropland. And I'm not going to spend too much time on the organic matter trends, which I think are important and I'd be happy to talk about, but or maybe outside the scope of the talk today. But what I want to note here is that for watersheds with at least 30% of the land area under non-cropland land uses, we're seeing a tendency towards decreasing nitrogen and phosphorus concentrations with increasing flow. And this might indicate, at least potentially, some limitation by sources with lower available nutrients. So these are likely a larger proportion of non-fertilized areas. And then where there is more than 60% of the cropland in the watershed, a relatively consistent increase tends to be observed with flow, suggesting that availability of water for transport rather than source is maybe what's limiting there.
Henry, I'm just going to break in and let you know that you have about 8 minutes left, and if we could have one of those minutes at least for a question, that would be great.
Okay. Okay, so sorry, I'm just going to check where I'm at here. So I think I presented an example of a typical pattern on an earlier slide, but overall more research is needed to evaluate nitrogen losses with snowmelt, particularly when we're talking about colder and non-tiled areas. We know that there's important considerations, including fertilizer and manure application rate, placement of applied nitrogen, losses, freeze-thaw, frozen soils. And snowmelt sources of nitrogen and nitrogen transport are a focus of ongoing research. But there's seasonal differences as well for phosphorus losses that occur with surface runoff, and these have received a little bit more attention. So I'll talk to those a little bit more, but the considerations are similar in terms of the land use factor driving it, and some of the links between soil phosphorus and fertilizer placement that are commonly observed in for rainfall runoff or with soil phosphorus in high concentration were mentioned by John last week. So I do want to just quickly explore that a little bit and whether there's any seasonality in that relationship. So what's shown in this plot is the same data, going back to the data from the Little and Others data set from Alberta that John had last week. And we can see that there's a relationship where we have particularly high concentrations of soil phosphorus near the surface and we see high concentrations in snowmelt runoff. And so I've added a few points here that my colleague Jane Elliott with Environment and Climate Change Canada was kind enough to share with me for comparison, that were collected in the Red River Valley near Winnipeg with our methods to compare with this relationship, and they more or less follow the expected trend. So they both used the Kelowna soil test there. But we've also been working with a network of field sites in Manitoba to explore factors that influence nutrient runoff seasonally from fine textured clay and clay loam soils. And when we look across this network, extractable phosphorus near the soil surface is the best predictor that we see of concentration in snowmelt runoff, although there's some scatter in the relationship that relates to soil moisture and volume of snowmelt. And that's something that I'm hoping to talk about a little bit more in a transport pathways talk next week. But what's shown here are the mean soil test values for 0 to 5 centimeters and flow-weighted mean concentrations over multiple years at these sites for snowmelt. And so just to simplify the presentation of that data set, but what it's illustrated is this positive trend is present even when we are looking at soils where the concentrations are managed within recommended fertility guidelines. And so I did a bit of a back of the envelope, or Jane did some back of the envelope conversion here, and so I plotted her points for comparison. And they do follow a similar trend as well. So these are sites with clay and clay loam soils in the Assiniboine and Red River basins. And so the scatter here, again, is likely partly due to antecedent conditions in that we don't have the exact same combination of years for each site. So getting back to the question of whether seasonal differences in phosphorus source are likely for these cropland sites, I'll quickly mention that phosphorus near the soil surface is also the best predicted concentration for rainfall runoff events, although those are more rare, but when we see that with a smaller data set. And so what I'm showing here, because we know that relationship is there, is just a plot of average snowmelt concentration against average rainfall runoff flow-weighted mean concentrations that were observed at our Manitoba study sites. And so points above the one line indicate higher concentrations being observed with rainfall runoff. And so there are some other potential changes with source with snowmelt, but I won't go into those as much yet, other than just to say that the potential is there for high concentrations during both seasons. So thinking about some of the implications here, when we think about the seasonality of export and concentration that have been observed, we can start to speculate on implications for climate change and timing of runoff events. So it's worth noting that dissolved phosphorus concentrations are as high or higher in large summer rainfall runoff events when we compare those with snowmelt, at least for fields and small agricultural streams. For nitrogen, we see movement mainly as nitrate, and those concentrations are often lower in streams, at least we've seen, during rainfall runoff events, or larger rainfall runoff events anyway. And this may be related to lower concentrations at the source, or just more extensive transformation in wetlands and riparian areas. And nitrogen tends to be more, or quickly reactive, I guess. And overall, it seems likely that if the frequency of extreme events changes, or we see more of that with rainfall, similar magnitude events with rainfall in the summer, we may also see a shift in nitrogen and phosphorus ratios, or if there's any disproportionate export happening. So I think I have time to touch on this slide, and this is the last one I've got. So I'm going to end by suggesting that seasonality, or more generally temporal patterns of nitrogen and phosphorus loading, are largely a function of antecedent conditions leading up to runoff events, or at least response to an event. So what's presented here is a conceptual framework from McMillan and others, describing the effects of antecedent conditions on source availability and hydrologic connectivity. The two left panels here describe changes in source as temporal functions of recent event history or longer legacies. And the two right panels describe changes in connectivity and water export with either short-term weather or long-term modifications to the drainage network, so longer-term modifications. And then I've added a few regionally relevant examples to these panels just to provide some context. So for example, if a source tends to be depleted over time, as would be the case with for application of fertilizer, then runoff occurring soon after that's likely to result in greater export. So that's a timing effect. If snowmelt occurs after a dry summer, and so maybe there's some room for storage there, then the opposite's likely true. And if we look at these,
Finish up.
oh, okay.
Yep.
So, okay, well, I'll leave these. I can finish up with that. The other points are here. Just maybe pointing out that for phosphorus, often the source changes are a longer term process, balance between inputs and outputs, and changes in connectivity or something probably we know are happening or to keep in mind when we think about loading in some of the hydrology. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. Hopefully that leaves some time for questions.
We are out of time, and we thank all three of our presenters for, I know this was a relatively short time to put a lot of information in, and we are going to have those this presentation available for folks so you can go back and take a look at some of the slides that maybe we had a little bit less time on than everyone would prefer. And Henry Wilson, I think Henry Van Offelen has a question for you in the chat box. So you can just, we're not going to address it here right now, but you can go ahead and take a look at that and hopefully get back to Henry either now or when we're in Crookston. Okay, so yeah, so thank you everyone for taking some time out today to do this preview and get all ramped up for our workshop in Crookston, April 16th through 17th on the University of Minnesota Crookston campus. And if you, all the rest of the workshop information, including the agenda and time for us to get together for a little mixer are all there. And we hope the weather clears up for everybody as people are traveling to Crookston, and we look forward to seeing you there. So again, thanks so much to our presenters for putting this great information together, and my apologies for rushing you along here a little bit. And Mike L. is saying we will have some time to review these presentations next Tuesday and can answer some of the questions then. Yep, thanks for that reminder, Mike. Okay. Well, have a great weekend, everyone. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you soon.